Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly, by Director of Momentous Change and now the SNP candidate for Falkirk East, Michelle Thomson. Michelle, how are you doing today? Grand. Now, we've only got Michelle for part of the show, so we are going to focus on her a wee bit more for the first half of the show. But we're also joined by writer and broadcaster Ken McDonald. Ken, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. And so we start this evening, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 1,194,269 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 1,097,507 were negative, 96,762 were positive. There were 951 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, and sadly 38 new reported deaths. Of course, this will be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will show symptoms and not everyone will necessarily get tested. As we always do, we urge you, if you are showing symptoms of a new dry persistent cough, a fever or a change in your sense of taste or smell, please do book a test as soon as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 991 people in hospital last night, 68 of whom were in intensive care. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 3,797. This number only includes those who have died in hospital, having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures published today show that 59,699 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 648 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And as at the 29th of November, 5,634 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published by National Records of Scotland today. Between the 23rd and 29th of November, 252 deaths were registered, which mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, an increase of 6 from the previous week. Over two-thirds of the people who died in the latest week were aged 75 or over, and 14% were aged under 65. In the latest week, there were 51 COVID-related deaths in the Glasgow City area, 30 in South Lanarkshire and 24 in North Lanarkshire. The majority occurred in hospitals, representing 165 deaths. 75 occurred in care homes and 12 occurred at home or in another non-institutional setting. And just to put these numbers in context, at this point in the pandemic, Scotland has recorded 7.5% of the UK's COVID-related deaths, with around 8.2% of the population. It's also notable that at this point, the number of deaths in Scotland appears to be declining somewhat, while there have been rises elsewhere in the UK. And just before we get on with the rest of today's news, if you'd like to join the conversation here, you can do so on Twitter by following us at Broadcast Scot and using the hashtag Scotland@7. And as you can see on the screen now, we will be flashing those tweets up on the screen throughout the show, so do please get in touch. But our first story is COVID related as well. Deliveries of the first coronavirus vaccine to Scotland are expected to be made early next week, with injections being given from Tuesday the 8th of December. The Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency has confirmed that the vaccine developed by Pfizer and BioNTech has been authorised for use in the UK. The vaccine, which must be stored at well below freezing, will be transported to 23 locations around the country in temperature-controlled lorries. Everyone being vaccinated will need 2 vaccines between 21 and 28 days apart. Those giving the vaccination to others will receive the injection first. The programme will then follow the independent advice received from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, which recommends prioritising those with the greatest clinical need, including those aged over 80 and health and social care workers. The storage requirements mean logistics around delivery to care homes are more challenging, and they are currently under consideration. So, Ken, we'll come to you first on this. As a science correspondent, I'm sure this is something you've been keeping quite an eye on. But you've also had a vaccine yourself, haven't you?
Yes, I'm taking part in a trial of a vaccine made by the company Novavax. It's not yet in wide release. This is what's called a phase 3 trial. It's when it actually goes out to usually well over 10,000 people. In this case, it's something like 15,000 people in the UK. How this one works is different from the Pfizer one. Well, I'm saying it works. We don't know if it works yet, but how it is meant to work is that it injects essentially spike proteins, the little proteins that actually are on the surface of the coronavirus that punch their way through the walls of cells. Now, it injects them without the nasty payload that the coronavirus has. And
Mm.
that should trigger an immune response, an antibody response, and possibly also T cells, which also attack the virus. The phase 2 trials, which were much less wide, a much smaller number of people, they didn't show any major problems, and they did show an interesting antibody response. This is obviously what they're hoping to see in the trial that I've been going through at the moment.
Hmm. And as far as the rollout of this vaccine goes, I mean, it's relatively small numbers at the moment. It's we're having to prioritize who gets it. Do you think the process of prioritization and the rollout looks like it's something that the Scottish government is going to be on top of?
It does. They seem to be very confident about this. And the other thing is that it's a four nations approach. So all the four nations have agreed on what their priorities are. And the priorities are the people at the very most at risk to begin with. And that's people who are over 80, people who work in the front line and they deserve pretty immediate protection, people who work in hospitals and so on, people who work in care homes. And then it'll work its way through people with underlying health conditions. It'll then do it by age group. So it's going to take a while before it gets to people below 50. In fact, I think you're looking into next year before you actually get to that age group, but it will work through the over 80s, the under 80s, the under 70s, the under 60s, and eventually it should cover as many people as it possibly can. And bear in mind, this is just the first vaccine, and also bear in mind this is an emergency use exemption, as the Americans call it, an American use viral vaccine. It has not got full approval yet, but they do feel confident enough, the UK government, or some might say desperate enough, given that the levels of deaths in the
Mm.
UK, that they want to get this out and be indeed the first nation in the world to approve this vaccine for widespread use.
Now, the whole world has had to deal with the problem of anti-vax people for quite some time. How worried are you that that may be a problem when it comes to rolling this out? That perhaps the speed at which it's come out and the fact that, as you say, it's not gone through a normal regulatory process is going to increase people's anxiety about it.
Yes, it will go through. It is going through the normal regulatory process at the moment. It's just going to take a while,
Mm.
and they've
Yeah.
decided not to take a risk with it. But they know from phase one trials. Phase one trials are basically, is this going to kill anybody? It hasn't. Then the phase two trials are wider. Is it going to cause any serious side effects, and does it actually produce antibodies? That seems to be working as well. What the phase three trials suggested was that even with lots of people, then you still don't get
Mm.
major side effects, major problems. That's all good news. But there are always going to be people who are simply suspicious of vaccines, and there's a lot of. I mean, I used to be a science correspondent. It's a lot of nonsense. You are not being injected with 5G microchips so that Bill Gates can control your mind. Really not. This is not a huge piece of disaster capitalism conspiracy, which is attempted to, if you like, crash the world economy and make us more subservient. It's just not like that. There are better ways to control people than this.
Yeah. Michelle, coming to you now on this. This question, obviously, of who's getting the vaccine and when. Do you have any concerns that now that there is a vaccine, in range that we can see it on the horizon for most of us? Do you worry that that will affect people's compliance with the existing restrictions, which obviously we still need until we've got much more widespread vaccination?
I mean, there's clearly that possibility. I mean, we've got Christmas coming up, and people can take a view on the kind of 5 days off, if you like, and the corresponding spike afterwards. But I think I would worry that people start to get a lot more relaxed and say there's a vaccine coming along. And if you look at the figures from today, They're saying that's 800,000 vaccines. Well, assuming Scotland's population share of roughly 8%, that's 64,000 vaccines for Scotland, of which everyone needs 2. So that's 32,000 doses out of this first batch, and plus the logistical challenges, even though I agree with Ken that the tiering of how it will be administered has been well worked out, this is still going to take a while to roll through. So I personally do worry a bit that people will get more relaxed. And if you ask my view on it, I'd say no, caw canny. This is still an incredibly dangerous virus. The end is merely some, a few paces, a few roads down, but we've still got some way to go. And I think people need to urge, be cautious, because it's still a killer virus.
Mm-hmm. And this question of the transporting of a vaccine rather, that needs to be kept at such low temperatures obviously adds a layer of complication. How hopeful are you about these other vaccines that are perhaps going to be a bit easier to administer? Do you expect that we'll maybe see more of that in the coming weeks?
Yeah, well, they will be looking at the data, of course, and there'll be the data, effectiveness, availability. Because I think the comment today was, this isn't a yogurt you can take out the fridge and put back in again, which was a very good way of explaining how vital it is that it's kept cold, and we know the other vaccines vary in that respect. But I think there will be a tremendous balancing effort to get the throughput of people vaccinated against the number of vaccines coming through. And maybe, if we're honest, we don't have that many choices. We have to get it rolled out there. So I agree with what Ken's saying about the anxiety that's driving some of the measures of this because of the underlying danger of COVID.
Yeah. Well, we move on to another COVID-related story now, and Scotland's first community testing site for people without symptoms to get tested for coronavirus has opened in Johnson in Renfrewshire today. Up to 12,000 asymptomatic residents will be able to be tested at the drop-in test site located at Johnson Town Hall over the next 8 days. Residents will be tested using lateral flow devices, which can give people the results in around 45 minutes. Any positive cases will then be confirmed by the more accurate PCR test. The community asymptomatic test site is the first of its kind in Scotland and forms part of a community testing pilot announced by Health Secretary Jean Freeman last week to trial wider community testing in 5 local authority areas where transmission rates remain stubbornly high. 6 mobile testing units and 20,000 home testing kits are being deployed to test asymptomatic people who live in targeted communities across Glasgow, Renfrewshire, East and South Ayrshire and Clackmannanshire, and the result of these trials will inform wider expansion of targeted community testing planned for January. Over 4,155 people have already been tested through the existing sites that have been set up in Dalmarnock, West Pollock-Shields, Stewarton, Girvan and Alloa. So Michelle, I'll come to you on this one. This is something that a number of people have been calling for some time, to get people tested even when they're not showing symptoms. Do you think this trial looks like it's going to have the effect that people want?
Well, it's very hard to call that because it's underway. We don't know, but we've got a great deal to learn about the kind of penetration of the virus, the actual underlying science, which I'm sure Ken will go into himself in terms of what are the key features that make some people asymptomatic and others not. What will the take-up be? As you indicate, the take-up already seems to be quite high. I think one of the things that people might not consider is that the trust factors being relatively high, or in fact very high in the Scottish Government, will probably incline more people to go and do that. And also the sense of community spirit we have in Scotland. I think the adherence to the rules rate has been quite high because we believe there is such a thing as society, that we believe we all have a duty and a responsibility. So I think that will also furnish the take-up rate. But I'll let Ken come in this, but I am interested in starting to read more about the data, about how not just people that are affected, those people that haven't been very badly affected or haven't been affected at all, what are the key indicators about them? And I think, it will take a long time for that data to come through, but Ken, as I say, what I suspect will know more about this with his background.
Yeah, well, Ken, I will come to you on this. I mean, we saw, for example, there was some criticism of the UK government's mass testing in Liverpool recently. Do you think the Scottish government has learned some lessons from that around this trial in Johnston?
I think they couldn't help but learn from it. Actually, it was obviously the first rollout of it in Liverpool. It's a deprived area. Lots of people with lots of people living together under the same roof. That's absolutely classic territory for spreading coronavirus. We talk about the R number. Let's say, heaven forbid, it's not the case, but let's say there was an R number of 2. I mean, if one person got the virus, then after one cycle, 2 people would catch it, and then 4, and then so on. What the R number you would have to do was try and keep it below 1 to make it go down. Now, if you don't know how many people are actually displaying the virus, because actually they're not displaying the virus, but they could still be shedding it. And that's the thing. It doesn't pass on in a linear or exponential way like that. It doesn't pass on from one person to 2. It's actually, generally speaking, 80% of people who have this virus, whether or not they show symptoms, don't actually pass it on to anybody at all. But that 20% of people they're the ones around whom the clusters build. And this is a clustering virus. It's also, I mean, I hate to say it's a clever virus. It's not. It can't think. It just wants to reproduce. That's what it does. But what it did that was more effective than SARS, which is its cousin, if you like. SARS was very deadly, but killed people too quickly to spread it. Now, coronavirus kills people actually less well, if you like, or less effectively, but takes longer to spread. And that means it actually doesn't kill people quickly enough so that they can then pass on the virus to somebody else. That's why coronavirus is a success, and that's why it's so deadly. And it's also the case that most people who have coronavirus don't show symptoms or show only very mild symptoms. So until you do this community testing, you're actually trying to hit a target that you can't see.
And Ken, what do you expect then to come out of this if we can see much wider asymptomatic testing? How quickly can that help us really bring numbers of infections down, do you think?
It's still going to be hugely important. There is, as Michelle said, a big danger that people will just breathe out and say, oh, well, here comes a vaccine, then there'll be another one after that. It will take months. It might not be till next summer. It might be even longer before we see people properly protected. The World Health Organization, while welcoming what the UK government did today, said, you know what, nobody relax. There could be a third wave of this stuff before the vaccines are widely available. That's what we have to worry about. And that is why it is important to be able to follow what the World Health Organization has said from day one, which is test, trace and isolate. Now, Scotland's been pretty good at that. It's certainly been much better at tracing and isolating than down south, where it's been absolutely dismal, to be honest, because in Scotland used people with experience of tracking down diseases to train up other people who then gained experience of tracking down this particular disease. That's why Scotland adopting the community approach has been much more effective than the UK government, whose first instinct and continued instinct is to outsource it to the big sorts of companies that really only exist to be outsourced to. And it hasn't worked in any way close to being able to force down the virus.
Well, just a wee reminder there that new centre is in Johnston, and also Dalmarnock, West Pollokshields, Stewarton, Girvan and Alloa. We would urge you, if you are in any of those areas, please do take part in this, because as we've said, it helps all of us. But we move on now, and a new poll shows that voters in Scotland are continuing to put their trust in the SNP to protect the NHS and jobs in the face of a disastrous hard Brexit, with a majority of voters also backing Scotland's right to choose its own future. This is the 15th poll in a row which shows a majority of people would vote yes in an independence referendum. The Ipsos Murray poll conducted for STV shows that the SNP would also win 55% of the constituency vote in next year's election, putting the party on course to win a majority of seats at Holyrood. So Michelle, I'll come to you first on this. As somebody who's just been selected as an SNP candidate, it must be fairly heartening to hear that the polls are looking so good for you just now.
I have to say, perhaps I've become a bit of an old cynic since I got involved in this politics lark. I mean, of course, it's heartening, when we had so many years in the doldrums. But I exercise a very, very cautious approach, both in terms of percentage votes of independence, and we may well talk about issues with Section 30 orders and so on, and with people who say they are going to vote SNP, because it's a big if to say that the results here would translate into an incredible 73 seats for the SNP and Tories in 22, Labour in 19, I think it was. So I just feel very cautious about it. And actually, the risk for us, both in the SNP and in the wider independence movement, is complacency. We think we're on a roll and we don't get out and do the work. We always have to do the work. We have to engage with people. We have to listen to them, hear their concerns, project a compelling vision of what the future could be, and also to make sure that our activists are galvanised. And in that, I would say that the SNP also have a very important role in the proposition that is put to the Scottish people in terms of May. It both has to galvanise and entice people to vote SNP, but it also has to galvanise our activists and our SNP activists to get out there and campaign. And we have seen other things where those two haven't quite landed in the way they should. So, to be honest, I'm quite cautious about it. I may well be cautiously optimistic, but I'm still quite cautious.
And obviously, the SNP in the last few days has had some divisions. There are some differences about what the strategy should be going forward. How do you see some of those conflicts being resolved before the election?
Well, I mean, before I got involved in this, I worked in large organisations, and one of the things I did was deliver so-called large transformational change programmes. And of course, they were always sold as they were going to change a universe, and they never quite worked out like that. But probably one of the singularly most important elements of any change programme was communication. Communication, communication, communication. And actually, I think this is where the SNP has not been doing a very good job, leading to a disconnect between its activists and kind of HQ. So the communication and the coalescence back around a common goal is going to be very, very important. And I've already seen some encouraging signs, because you do need leaders at this stage to say, wait a minute, guys. We know we've got strong disagreement on a variety of different things, and we don't want to go into them here because the debate's quite polarised, but we have to focus on the North Star. The North Star is fundamentally about independence, of which the SNP plays a very important political part, and of which the Yes movement plays a very important part as well, and getting those people back together. But I do think communication will be everything. And I think even SNP HQ itself would say that's something that they could have done better, particularly as people describe the great uplift in number of members of the SNP after 2014. I don't think they've really got their structure and the resourcing particularly right yet in HQ on how that works very effectively. And I know certainly at branch people have felt that they weren't listened to, engaged with, and all the things I said earlier about how we should treat our voters. So communication, cannot stress it enough.
Well, we will obviously see how that develops, but we move on now, and Constitution Secretary Michael Russell has said that the Scottish Government will continue to stand up for Scotland's interests in the face of the UK Government's reckless Brexit strategy. Mr Russell, in a letter to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, said the UK Government had to own the many and manifest problems with its negotiating strategy. The letter notes how badly the UK Government has engaged with the devolved governments and rejects Gove's claim that the Scottish Government has deliberately undermined the UK's negotiations with the EU. So Ken, I'll come to you first here. Do you agree with Michael Russell that the Scottish Government hasn't been trying to undermine the UK's negotiations? I mean, it does seem, from my point of view, that maybe the UK has done more to undermine the negotiations.
It does seem to be, I don't know, it seems to be a bit of a stretch to suggest that the Scottish Government, given how little London pays attention to, for want of a better term, the Celtic fringe, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, that somehow what we in Scotland, what our government was doing could somehow undermine that. Now, there were talk about maybe they were going behind the backs of the UK officials overfishing, but Scotland asked to have a seat at the table, asked to be part of these talks about fishing, and I was told no. So is it meant to sit stum for the rest of that time? I don't think so. And I think also it's Scottish independence is not just grievance politics, but it certainly doesn't harm it. And particularly if you want to spread stories about Scotland being shortchanged, it certainly helps if it's true, which it certainly is, and particularly in this case. And we only have to remember 2014. We were told the only way Scotland could guarantee continued membership of the EU was to vote no. Was to vote no to independence. So Scotland voted no to independence by 5%. And then within 2 years, Scotland was being taken out of Europe despite voting to remain. People do actually have long memories in politics sometimes, particularly when there are insults like that. And anything that Mike Russell can do to point out the extent to which all the other UK nations other than England are being treated by Westminster, it just helps jog people's memories a wee bit.
Now, Michelle, obviously, I'm sure you agree with Mike Russell's points that he's making. What do you think, though, is driving the UK government? Because we've seen so much refusal to engage with the devolved governments, even with the Irish government over the very sensitive issue of the border. There's been a lack of communication. What do you think is going wrong in Whitehall?
Well, it's fundamentally a complete and utter lack of respect. I mean, they used to give the illusion of caring before for a while, but they've certainly a long time ago, particularly with the current version of Tories, if you like, given up any pretense of caring. And there is a fundamental lack of respect you see running through all the institutions of Westminster. I mean, most people will see it exhibited in like PMQs and the way some of the Tory MPs shout and jeer at the SNP MPs when they're asking questions. They ignore them, they talk over them, and so on. But it actually extends to all the departments. And even now, it's a complete afterthought. The likes of Treasury, they just forget all about Scotland. They forget all about Northern Ireland and Wales as well, because frankly, they're not interested. And what we've got now is a development into this kind of hectoring, eat your cereal approach from the likes of Boris Johnson and Gove. And of course, it just doesn't wash. The idea, just to finish off on this, that Scotland are to blame, frankly ridiculous. They're looking for anybody to blame for their mess. And I genuinely am very confident, because it starts to permeate other sectors of society who are not traditionally SNP or independent supporters, are going to look around and say, what a mess. It is going to be carnage, and we're certainly not out of the woods in terms of a no-deal Brexit. And then it's going to start to permeate every area of our society. So, yeah, the blame lies fairly and squarely with the UK government and the Tories. So I completely agree with Mike Russell, and I'll be punting that message, that's for sure.
Well, Michelle, I know we only have you until past, so that does seem like a very good point for you to end on. Thank you so much for joining us, Michelle, and I do hope we'll see you again very soon.
Thanks, Ed. Bye. Bye. Bye.
But we move on now to another Brexit-related story, and the Tory government has come under further criticism over its failure to properly prepare for Brexit, after a damning new report warned of the risk of serious disruption and delay at the border, which could impact on the flow of goods and fresh food supplies in the middle of a pandemic. The Cross-Party Public Accounts Committee also accused the UK government for still only taking limited responsibility for its lack of post-Brexit preparedness, and that at this late stage it has not provided key information needed by businesses to prepare. Earlier, the Irish Road Haulage Association stated that the first 6 months of 2021 would be terrible, as the port is not ready to cope with the change. And the Road Haulage Association warned that it still did not know if a single driver would be able to bring over goods from the continent, due to there being no allocation of permits at the moment. Meanwhile, Irish broadcaster RTE is reporting that EU chief negotiator Michel Barnier has told ambassadors that Brexit talks would be thrust into crisis if UK legislation expected next week includes clauses that would breach the existing withdrawal agreement. And I believe the legislation that they're referring to there is a finance bill which is going to change some regulations. But Ken, this lack of preparedness, this is something we've been hearing from various industrial sectors for the last couple of months. We're now, less than a month away, and there is still no clarity on a lot of these issues. What do you think? What do you think the outcome is going to be if people have to adjust to a whole new system of trading without really any notice to get ready for it?
It's very difficult to see how it's not going to be disastrous. It really is. Because, as you say, we're now in the last month. We actually left, or rather the United Kingdom decided to leave left the European Union at the beginning of this year. We have already left. We're now in a transition period. They're still talking about it. They're still talking about it down to it looks like the last minute, and it looks like there are still major problems. But meanwhile, on the parallel track, if there were to be no deal, and let's face it, any kind of deal that they're going to be able to get at the moment, at this stage, is going to be very nearly as bad as no deal. Even then, we don't seem to have the contingency measures in place, the plans in place, other than a few enormous lorry parks and huge numbers of portaloos being arrayed across Kent. I don't know if you saw, somebody's been around defacing the Kent county signs as you enter Kent, and it says Kent, the toilet of England, because that's what they expect to be. And you have to wonder, what else did they expect when they decided to do this?
And Ken, specifically, coming back to the question of vaccines, we know obviously that this vaccine that's being rolled out now needs to be kept very cold, which is not easy if you're going to be held up at customs for a long time. We've also, Philippa Whitford, for example, has talked a lot about radioisotopes that can't survive, they decay before very long. And they would be in trouble if they get held up at customs. How big are those kind of problems going to be, do you think?
They have the potential to be very serious indeed, obviously. And it's not just vaccines, it's not just radioisotopes, it's any kind of pharmaceuticals on which people depend. As you may remember, you're probably too young, Kenny, actually, but we used to have manufacturing industry in this country on a very large scale. And actually, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the few manufacturing industries we have left. But even so, we are still dependent on a huge number of pharmaceutical companies and plants around the world, and particularly across Europe, to bring us the medicines we need. Now, there is the distinct possibility, that's well certainly been bruited abroad, that it may be that the vaccines that people need are not able to come in on time because they're held up. All I would say in that is it will not be a good look for the EU to be seen to be holding up imports, because that's how it will be portrayed. And imports of important and life-saving vaccines in some kind of revenge raid. So, as I say, not a good look, and not one I think they will play into. I don't think they will want to be seen to be doing that. But that doesn't mean that, for example, you're going to be possibly running short of wine, for example. Will be okay for whiskey, but there are other imports which we have taken for granted because we were members of a huge trading bloc, which suddenly could well be subject to World Trade Organization rules, and certainly will be subject to enormous amounts of paperwork.
Yeah. Well, we will just wait and see. As I say, we have until the 31st of December to find out. But we move on, and Tesco has announced that it intends to repay approximately £575 million in business rates relief. The Scottish Government's Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, has welcomed the news, saying that it was a public-spirited announcement from Tesco, who, along with other essential retailers, have played an important part in Scotland's response to the pandemic. Ms. Forbes went on to say, at the beginning of the pandemic, the effects on businesses were uncertain, and Tesco acknowledged that the rates relief provided by the Scottish Government gave them the confidence to retain staff and ensure essential supplies were available to customers. Now the situation has evolved and Tesco's business is proving to be resilient. I am pleased that the company are willing and able to refund the public support provided, which we estimate to be in the region of £60 million. We will ensure this money is fully spent on those who have been hardest hit during Scotland's recovery from COVID. If other businesses find themselves in the same position, I can assure them that every penny of support returned will be reinvested in supporting Scotland's hardest hit businesses, alongside investment in our communities and our economy. So Ken, I mean, this is good news, obviously, but it does perhaps raise a couple of questions about how certain types of support were allocated at the beginning of the pandemic, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely, yeah. So one of the, if you could accuse the Scottish Government of getting if anything wrong in its response to this pandemic, and of course it has, because all governments have, because they were making it up as they go along. But it does seem to be that the ones, the areas at which they got particularly wrong were the ones where they adopted the four-nation approach, which is a bit worrying because we're doing a four-nation Christmas, we're doing a four-nation vaccine rollout, but nevertheless, one of those, most egregiously, I think, was the dispensation of the decanting of old people who it turned out had coronavirus into care homes, and that created all sorts of problems. But the other one was the idea that they didn't lock down early enough. None of the governments did. The Scottish, the Welsh and Northern Irish governments couldn't until the English government went. And the English government went for lockdown, the first one, at least 2 weeks too late. And the rest, as you can see, in the death toll, the number of people with long COVID, the number of people who have been infected. And the response to getting that wrong was to throw billions at it in an attempt to catch up in things like opening Nightingale hospitals, in things like PPE, and in supporting industry and supporting people's jobs. And supporting people's jobs was a great thing. With hindsight, should they have given Tesco's £500 million? Probably not, but the future was unwritten then. We all now have 2020 hindsight. I don't want to sound like Boris Johnson talking about Captain Hindsight here when he talks about Keir Starmer, but nevertheless, on reflection, Tesco didn't need the money. Tesco are now handing it back because, again, it's all about, as the Americans say, the optics. It would not look good if they didn't hand the money back. And you can expect to see a fair degree of naming and shaming if other companies don't agree to put their hands up and then stick them in their pockets and give back the dosh that the government gave them, which tidied things over in the short term, but they didn't need. The other thing it underlines, just to quickly stick in here, it underlines also that the essential workers aren't just the people in the front line of the health service, although that's enormously important. Everybody who kept the taps running, the bins empty, and who is still doing that, the people who made sure that we could get baked beans and after a short interruption, toilet paper, also did and are continuing to do a risky and an enormously valuable job.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we move now across the Atlantic, and the US Justice Department is investigating a potential crime related to funneling money to the White House in exchange for a presidential pardon, according to court documents unsealed in federal court. US District Judge Beryl Howell yesterday released a heavily redacted order that described what she called a bribery for pardon investigation. About half of the 18-page document was blacked out, with the publicly available version providing few details of the alleged scheme and naming none of the people potentially involved. It said federal prosecutors in Washington said they had obtained evidence of a bribery scheme in which someone would offer a substantial political contribution in exchange for a presidential pardon or reprieve of sentence. The order said prosecutors were also investigating a secret lobbying scheme in which two unidentified individuals acted as lobbyists to senior White House officials without complying with the registration requirement of the Lobbying Disclosure Act. According to Howell's order, government investigators said they had seized over 50 digital media devices, including iPhones, iPads, laptops, thumb drives, and computer and external hard drives. Presidents enjoy wide latitude under the US Constitution in pardoning people convicted of federal crimes. President Trump last week pardoned his former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who had twice pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI during the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election. So, Ken, I think not many people will be surprised to hear rumblings of corruption around the Trump White House, but this is quite a startling allegation, isn't it?
It certainly is, although we don't actually know against whom the allegations have been made. The names of the companies have been blacked out. It's all been redacted. But the other thing that struck me about it as well, that these are documents which were laid down back in August. So this is not any last minute stuff. We're starting to see the last minute stuff now, where people like Steve Bannon are kind of trying to sidle up to the president and say, any chance of a pardon, Gov? And indeed, he'll want to try and pardon as many people as he possibly can. Except, of course, he is nattering about possibly running again in 2024, which would mean he doesn't want to be covered in any more glore than he already is. But it is a fascinating set of circumstances to see this stuff. And it is also interesting that it's a group of news organisations that actually went to the court and said, we want this unsealed. Mm-hmm. And they found it, which is, I would like to see them try and do that in this country. We are now looking at what is going to happen in the dying days of this man's presidency, which I think everybody in the world, even his Attorney General, now recognise is the case, even if he doesn't. But you were spot on there when you pointed out, Kenny, that it's federal crimes that the president can pardon people for. Mm-hmm. So, for example, it may be a federal crime, for example, that Steve Bannon possibly misunderstood the purpose of the crowdfunder. People thought they were giving money to build a wall with Mexico, when in fact they just appeared to be giving Steve Bannon money, allegedly. We will have to see about that one. That's a federal crime. Donald Trump can wipe that one clean if he wants. Meanwhile, at a state level, the other state attorneys general may actually be interested in crimes for which possibly a former president would not be able to even pardon himself. Things like Trump University, which was obviously going to be the best university in the world. I mean, nobody knows more about universities than Donald Trump, but and turned out to be a complete burach. So I think what you may see there is that Mr. Trump may still be pursued for some time by my learned friends. He may, I mean, there is a possibility, I heard it said, that he will resign with a day to go, and then Mike Pence, acting President Pence, will pardon Donald Trump. That's only for federal crimes, though, so see you in court, Donald.
And Ken, Donald Trump was elected 4 years ago on a promise that he was going to drain the swamp, that he was going to get rid of all the corruption in Washington. And it does seem that he has, at best, not done that job, and at worst, has actually made it even worse. Do you think that Joe Biden's presidency can start to change that, or do you think some of this corruption is just now so endemic in Washington that it's not possible to drain that swamp?
It's always been going on. I mean, it's been going on with the Teapot Dome scandal, with which I'm only vaguely familiar. Richard Nixon, I was just old enough to remember him. He was at it. You had Mark Rich, the guy who set up Glencore, right? Now late Mark Rich, convicted of tax evasion. He was on the run. Bill Clinton pardoned him in the dying days of his presidency. Mark Rich was regarded as such a high-value crook that it's okay, he's dead. That he was able to. He was not able to come into America to attend his own daughter's funeral for fear that he might be pinched. That's how bad it was. And that was a Democrat president that did that. They all do it. They all sign off on somebody. The fact, for example, that Mark Rich was a major Democratic Party donor obviously had nothing to do with it. But and you will expect to see this again. Can Joe Biden do much about it? Would Joe Biden want to? Without being perhaps quite as crooked as previous incumbents of the White House, because let's face it, on recent evidence, it would be pretty difficult to hit that mark. You could see Joe Biden recognising that that's the way American politics works. He's been in it for nearly 50 years. He knows how it works.
Well, we move to the other side of the world, and Joshua Wong, one of Hong Kong's most prominent democracy activists, has been jailed for more than 13 months over an anti-government rally in 2019. This is the toughest and most high-profile sentence for an opposition figure this year. Wong's sentence comes as critics say the Beijing-backed government is intensifying a crackdown on Hong Kong's opposition and chipping away at wide-ranging freedoms guaranteed after the former UK colony returned to Chinese rule in 1997, a charge which authorities in Beijing and Hong Kong reject. Reacting to the ruling, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab urged Hong Kong and Beijing authorities to stop their campaigns to stifle opposition. Wong had pleaded guilty to organising and inciting an unlawful assembly near the city's police headquarters during the height of the demonstrations in June last year. He faces a maximum of 3 years in jail. "I know the coming days will be tougher. We will hang in there," Wong, wearing a black sweater and surgical face mask, shouted after the sentence was read out. "It's not the end of the fight," Wong said later through his lawyers. Now, Ken, this struggle in Hong Kong has been going on for several years. It's been on a bit of a slow boil this year after, obviously, COVID kind of dampened down some of the protests. But the Beijing government and the Hong Kong government acting with them, or at least with their approval, really haven't stopped cracking down on the pro-democracy activists. Do you see any way for the West, for countries like Britain, to have any impact on that, to have any influence to make things easier for the pro-democracy activists?
I don't see the United Kingdom having any influence on this at all. Unfortunately, it's not an important or powerful enough nation anymore. That's the bottom line. It may still have a seat at the UN Security Council, but that's as a result of having a nuclear deterrent, and for historical reasons as well. If the UK really wants to do something about democracy in Hong Kong, it should get in a time machine and go back about 100 years and introduce democracy in Hong Kong, because Britain was in charge of Hong Kong. It was a UK colony for well over 100 years, and at no point did they give people democratic rights. And it does come across as fairly rich that the UK government is in fact, a UK government is criticising China for this now, even though it's currently threatening to, in certain limited circumstances, break international law. Now, that's one side of the argument, but the other side of the argument, of course, is China. Why would China want to behave like this? Because China is, despite its relatively small size, China is worried about what influence Hong Kong and the democracy movement in Hong Kong might have on the rest of China. That was one of the reasons why Britain was fairly sanguine about letting Hong Kong go back. It really had no choice, but it handed Hong Kong back, and there was a hope among not just the UK, but among Western powers, that it would act as a kind of almost like a vaccine injected into China, which would inject it, if you like, it would be an anti-communist vaccine, a pro-democracy vaccine, and its influence would spread, and prosperity and democracy would spread with capitalism. And unfortunately for the West, China's found a way of doing capitalism without having democracy, which is fairly disturbing, because it can. It's one of the global superpowers, is making it look as if perhaps the sort of liberal democracy that we love and that we hold dear is perhaps a luxury that can be afforded only to richer Western countries.
Well, we will obviously keep an eye on what goes on in Hong Kong, but we come back home now. And guidance has been published for the house building industry ahead of new regulations on sprinklers coming into effect next year. The changes mean that all new build social homes, flats and shared multi-occupied residential buildings must be fitted with automatic fire suppression systems from March of next year. Previously, this was only required in new high-rise blocks of flats above 18 metres. It comes after David Stewart, MSP, proposed a private member's bill to improve safety in new social housing following the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. A number of outreach events are being held with providers of new homes in the run-up to implementation next March. Now, obviously, Ken, the Grenfell Tower fire was a disaster. There were all sorts of things went wrong in that case. But the fact that it's led to some of these new kinds of regulations has to be some sort of positive, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, there's a considerable amount of pushback to this legislation because people are saying it's going to cost too much money, it's been brought in too quickly. But we do hear that about any kind of safety legislation. One of the things that has come across from the current evidence to Grenfell about the response of the companies which were providing the cladding was that some of them, or some individuals within them, seemed quite happy to game the results, to actually fiddle the tests in order to make their products look as if they wouldn't go up like a box of zip firelighters when in fact they did. And that displays that well, I think it's possibly Alistair Gray said this: money has no home or nation, it has no friends, and it won't stay long. And I think that really the bottom line for these big companies, big multinational companies, is profit. That's what they are legally obliged to provide legally obliged to provide dividends for their shareholders, and consequently, the bottom line is the money, and that perhaps a social conscience is a bit rarer than you might expect or might hope for in many boardrooms, or maybe you don't expect a social conscience in boardrooms, but it certainly does underline that it's what we were talking about earlier on, what Michelle was talking about as well, about things like the NHS and so on, and the way that Scotland hangs together. This is a society, and it takes a society and a properly run democracy in that its government is an expression of its people. And what is happening here is that it is the government, the state, that is having to step in and say, do this. We're not going to have a code of practice. We're not going to have targets. We're going to have a law, and you've got to do it. And as a result, people who would otherwise die are not going to die. I think that is very good news.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, excuse me, and we come on now to our final story of the evening. The new Scottish National Investment Bank has been set 3 core missions to ensure it addresses the grand challenges facing Scotland. The missions have been confirmed to the bank after being approved by MSPs. They state that the bank should, firstly, drive the move towards net zero emissions. The bank will invest to help Scotland become a leader in sustainable technology, services and industries. Secondly, to promote inclusive growth through investment in areas such as employment, housing, education and local regeneration. And thirdly, to address demographic change and enable people to flourish by investing in innovation, which helps businesses and organisations increase productivity, raise skill levels, and develop a healthier population. So, Ken, I don't think many of us would disagree with any of those priorities. Do you think the Scottish National Investment Bank has the potential to really deliver on all of those?
It certainly has, and I think one of the things that is interesting about this is the tension, if you like, between these aims, which are, I mean, some might criticise them as being mom's apple pie. They're a bit more than that. They're very ambitious aims, and they really set out the aims that the SNP would like to have for Scotland, and for an independent Scotland in particular. This is the sort of country that we aspire to be. But the board has been criticised for its very composition, because it does seem to be very, very staid, very traditional, coming from the if you like, the standard issue financialism, which we've seen, and has perhaps not provided everyone in the country with a level of comfort which we might have expected, and indeed has led to the aggrandizement of huge amounts of money with a very small number of people. So really, what these, if you like, fairly, I hate to use the term, but with a small c, conservative financialists and bankers are being asked to do, is provide the means to, using the current prevailing economic system, capitalism, to provide a bunch of pretty centre-left solutions to things, and I think that could be quite interesting. It's a real conundrum to set them, and I don't think they would sign up for any of them if they hadn't accepted. They haven't known what these aims were, and it just depends. We have to wait and see. That's a very correspondent thing to say, and I'm not a correspondent anymore. All pieces by correspondent either end with the words remains to be seen, or only time will tell. Well, I'm afraid, yeah, we are going to have to. It remains to be seen what happens here. But certainly, it's a very promising start. These are very promising aspirations. Now it has to be turned into a success. It has to be a success, because otherwise it will have been a waste of time and money. And it's a very, very difficult time to start this, because even after we get away from, if we do, from the economic catastrophe that's been caused by this coronavirus, and from the economic catastrophe which I suspect is going to be caused by Brexit, we will still find that the world is still on fire and the seas are still full of plastic, and you're going to be fighting an uphill struggle to try and make and generate any kind of social value from money at all.
Yeah, well, obviously it does remain to be seen how that will all play out, but that is all we have time for this evening. So thank you very much to Ken McDonald. It's been a real pleasure, Ken, to help you take a step up in the quality of broadcaster you appear on. We'd also obviously like to thank Michelle Thomson as well. She was called away at the last minute there, so we only got her for half an hour, but it's such a pleasure to have her on the show anyway. And we'd like to thank you at home as well. You're the reason we create these programs, so thank you so much for being with us. As many of you will know, we are running a crowdfunder at the moment. We would like to be able to employ a full-time editor here and some full-time journalists to try and help us increase the professionalism, the quality, the type of stories, the breadth of stories that we can cover here at Broadcasting Scotland. And here, as many of you may have seen this before, but we do have a wee video promoting that crowdfunder to show you now.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%. So as you will have seen there, if you would like to support this year's crowdfunder, please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/donate if you want to make a one-off donation. If you'd like to become a regular supporter, please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up there. We would be ever so grateful. Now, of course, we do also have if you're not able to support us financially, you can still help us if you follow us, first of all, on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, if you like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then you can share the shows around with your friends and family. Let them know what Broadcasting Scotland is, where we are, what we do, and why you think it's worth checking us out. You're by far the biggest way we have of spreading the word about where we are and what we do. So please help us out that way. Obviously, I mentioned employing. If you'd like to get involved in helping build a better broadcaster for Scotland, we'd love to hear from you. That is absolutely all we have time for tonight, though. So thank you once again to Ken McDonald. Thanks again to Michelle, if she's watching on catch up later on. Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7. I'll be back on Friday. But until then, thank you very much for joining us and have a great evening. Good night.